The recent string of videos of police shootings in the U.S., they're raising new questions about whom to trust when the cameras aren't rolling. For more on this, I'm joined by Philip Stinson. He's a professor in the criminal justice program there at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. He's joining us live from Ohio. Well, we have the dash cam video now. How important is it to the investigation, do you think?
Oh, I think it's very important to the investigation. The dash cam video is going to give us some evidence that we don't see in the smartphone video that the citizen took. So these are both important, though, because one of the problems I have with the citizen videos in these kinds of cases is that the video doesn't start rolling. They don't start filming until they realize there's some sort of a dispute between a police officer and a citizen, and that's when we've seen that they turn the video on and start rolling the video on their smartphones and recording. So typically, and we have this in this case as well, we don't know what happens in the seconds and the minutes leading up to the shooting. So the dash cam video will provide additional information about that. The problem with the dash cam video, it doesn't tell the whole story either, because as soon as the officer and the citizen, so in this case Officer Slager and Mr. Scott, as soon as they leave the area in front of the police car, the dash cam video isn't going to be able to record that. And that's why the body-worn cameras are so important, and that's why they need to be issued to all police officers. And together, between the dash cam video, the citizen videos, and the body-worn cameras, we can have a full picture and really try to get to the bottom of these situations and perhaps peel back some layers here and learn a little bit more about the police subculture and how these types of incidents occur.
Well, let me ask you about, let me just kind of follow up on what you're saying. So we've got the beginning of this story and we've got the end of the story, but the middle, and a lot can happen in the middle, is still missing.
Well, that's true. We don't know what led up to it. How did they get from the traffic stop location, which I believe was about a quarter mile from the field where Mr. Scott was shot? But I think it's also important to remember that, you know, what we do see on the video is very troubling. And I have two specific problems with the officer's conduct. The first is when Mr. Scott ran away from him, Mr. Scott was not a threat to the officer. The officer was not justified in shooting him because there was no imminent threat of serious bodily harm or deadly force being used against the police officer. But the troubling aspect about it is that the officer's first instinct was not to run after Mr. Scott and tackle him, but instead to shoot him as if it was for sport or if he was on the firing range. It's really shocking. And the second problem is that his second instinct, right after he shot him and handcuffed him, was to start a cover-up, to move the taser and to drop it, really as a high-tech drop gun. In other words, in the past, we've heard stories many years ago where law enforcement officers who were involved in a bad shooting would drop a throwaway gun and claim that the citizen had pointed the gun at them, and that's why they had to shoot him here. Clearly, the officer's intent in moving the taser and throwing it on the ground next to where Mr. Scott's body laid was to try to cover it up so he could later claim that Mr. Scott was trying to use the taser against the officer. Well, and we know that's just not what happened.
Well, let me ask you about the officer and some other issues that have come up. We just heard in Jim Spellman's report, Mario Givens talking about an incident that happened in 2013. He was allowed to stay on the force despite this complaint of using excessive force against another unarmed black man. And as I said, he spoke in Jim Spellman's story. Should the police have listened to him more closely, and should that have raised a red flag in a sense?
Well, you know, it's interesting. It's not very uncommon. It's not uncommon for a police officer to have citizen complaints filed against them, and typically it's you know, use of force, excessive force type complaints. So the more productive a police officer is on the street, the more street encounters they have with citizens, the more likely they're going to have more complaints. And then the problem with citizen complaints, in order to be able to take any sort of action against the police officer, you have a he said type of situation unless you have some other witnesses or some other demonstrative evidence that can corroborate what the citizen is saying. In other words, they're not going to take somebody's word and fire the police officer. But I should point out that the officer in this case was fired immediately when they realized what had happened. He was going to be charged with murder. And that's something we see in South Carolina. In my research, since South Carolina is a right-to-work state, they're very quick to fire an officer who gets in trouble. In other states, officers have more protections with their jobs. They can't be fired as quickly, and we don't see them getting fired as quickly. So I think that's a good thing, the way they handle it in South Carolina.
Philip, I only have time for one more question. You have the Eric Garner case in New York. You got Michael Brown in Ferguson, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, now the Scott case. Are they all just tragic, isolated cases, or are we weaving together a tapestry that's telling a much deeper story?
Well, I think there may be more of a story there, but this case is very different from the Michael Brown case and the Eric Garner case. Here we have somebody who's shot in the back, and the law is very clear in this country. A law enforcement officer can't shoot somebody in the back as they're running away from them with these types of facts. It just can't be done. So the murder charge is appropriate against the officer.
Philip Stinson joining us from Ohio. Thanks so much.